You are listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place.
Hey, this is Michael with Arcane Carolinas. I want to jump in at the front of this episode for just a second. We know there are folks who listen to this with their kids, and this episode eventually takes a turn towards historical true crime, including a crime I would not personally want to have to explain to a child. We do our best not to glamorize that crime and not to go into gory detail about it, because that holds no appeal for us and is not what we want our show to be about. Despite having covered a few historical crimes, we actively kind of try to avoid the true crime genre, in part because there are other shows who do it so much better. Shout out to fellow Carolinians' true crime buzz on that front. Thus, it's important to us to provide this content warning. What we thought was going to be a fun episode about an old-timey scam artist eventually revealed itself to be the story of a tragic and violent crime. And I don't want anyone out there to find themselves unpleasantly surprised and or having a difficult conversation about it with the young people with whom they share the show. Now, that said, thanks for listening. And at the end of the episode, I'll be back to talk a little about what Charlie and I talked about after we turned off the mics and kept discussing this topic, and then decided that we ought to try to include in the episode as well. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Charlie Bushaw, co-host of Arcane Carolinas.
And I'm multi-award winning novelist Michael G. Williams, co-host of Arcane Carolinas. I'm going to go ahead and take a second at the front to do just like a little bit of bragging. As we're recording this, it was yesterday, but by the time you hear this, it'll have been a while ago. But anyway, I yesterday got announced officially as the guest of honor for the first ever RetCon in Cary, North Carolina in February of 2023.
Ooh.
And they have specifically said they hope that we'll record something there.
Oh, really? This is the first I'm hearing of this.
Yeah.
I very selfishly get excited about the second half. The first half, I'm like, oh, that's great, man. Congratulations. Like, oh, no, you get to tag along too, bucko. Like, yay!
Yeah, the people running RetCon, it's a new fandom convention, science fiction and fantasy convention in the Triangle area of North Carolina. That's going to be their first year. I'm going to be the first guest of honor. And they specifically mentioned podcasting in the course of programming. That'll be a lot of fun.
That will be fun.
Yeah.
Give out some stickers.
The folks running it are unbelievably cool, so it's going to be a really good time.
I'll be there.
Yeah, it's going to be really good. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about something that I ran across in a book called Mountain Ghost Stories and Curious Tales of Western North Carolina. I read this and I remember reading it and at the time saying to you, hey, we need to talk about this person. This person needs to be an episode.
Mm-hmm.
That was a really long time ago.
Almost a year ago.
Yeah. So I had to sort of go back to the beginning and like redo all the research on it because I couldn't remember a thing about this person. But we're going to talk about Big Dan Keath, Gold Swindler.
It's a lengthy name and title, and I like it.
Yeah, I love it. This story happens in Rutherford County, North Carolina. And we talked about Rutherford County's history and especially its Native American history in the Strange Skies Over Chimney Rock episode. Mm-hmm. Because that's where Chimney Rock is. So I won't like launch back into all of it, but I will recap just enough to say what's now Rutherford County was part of Cherokee territory, and it contained their best passage into lower elevations to the east. Rutherford County is also next to Cleveland County, which is the setting for the events of our Nobby the Sasquatch episode. Mm-hmm. This episode actually touches a lot of other episodes' content in the course of its telling. And I've tried to kind of note in my notes where that happens. So the legend of Daniel Keath, as it is told, I'm going to start with how we tend to see this legend repeated.
So this is not just from that one book. This has been repeated for a while.
Yes, and there are variations on it.
Okay. Woo! I like it when they're not cut and dry. I'm sure the Swindler says he's great. It's in the name, really.
It really is. He liked himself quite a bit. Daniel Keath. The first thing that shows up in every version of this story is that by the standards of the 19th century, he was a giant.
So he was 5'6".
Well, it's funny you say that. He was reportedly, in some versions, he's 6'4" and weighs 240 pounds of solid muscle.
That's big.
And at that time, at the time that he died, 1880, the average height of an American man was, in fact, 5'6".
Oh, there you go.
So he's like nearly a foot taller than the average person at the time. The story, as it is told, is that he was born in 1848 in Kentucky. He grew up the 8th child of a farm laborer.
Ooh.
Yeah, right? That can't have been a great time. And his father died when Daniel Keath was just 13. Keath strikes out in search of a life of his own, which led him, at the age of 13, in 1861, to volunteer for the Confederacy. We talked in the Pink Lady episode about the fact that the Confederate Army used a lot of child soldiers. Mm-hmm. That's pretty common in Confederate military history. The Confederate military was, let's say, at its best, disorganized and ragtag. And they would take basically anybody who showed up. Sometimes they would just round up everybody over the age of 11 or 12 and force them into service.
Yeah, I think it was a patchwork of volunteers and conscriptions.
Yeah,
that's my understanding. Yeah,
in some ways there was this like expectation that prominent members of the community would raise parts of the army themselves and be the officers for those divisions.
Totally qualified. That's a great way to assemble a fighting force. You're Definitely. Rich. You're in charge.
They were attempting to establish a formalized aristocracy. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, ideologically, they needed to prove that the plantation owners were the best at everything, including running a military, and then they lost a war.
I'm picturing, what is his name? Candy from Django, Leonardo DiCaprio's character. Oh, raise an army. How? Yeah. I do not know.
Pretty much. The idea was they were going to prove that they were the best at everything, and they promptly went about losing the war. So good job. But he was one of these child soldiers, was in the Confederacy, but he immediately deserted.
So this is terrible.
Oh, yeah. He's not having a good time. From my perspective, this kind of demonstrates that maybe he was conscripted rather than volunteered, but I don't know.
And he's only 13, so at this point, he's medium Dan Keath.
Yeah.
So he could slip away without being noticed.
Instead of big Dan Keath, he's big for his age, Dan Keath. So.
Right. He can still get away without being noticed.
Yeah. After deserting the Confederacy as a child, there's really no other way to say it. He made his way to Indiana and he found work there, but then he robbed his employer's business and got run out of town.
As one does as a 13-year-old on the run.
Yeah. He then makes his way to Tennessee and again joins the Confederate Army and again immediately deserts.
They probably gave him like a fresh change of clothes and he was like, sweet, back on the run.
Yeah, pretty much. They probably handed him a bundle of hardtack and Confederate uniforms. If you were not the sort of officer who had a lot of money and could just buy your own uniform. One of the most interesting things that I've ever learned about, I don't know what to call it, materials science of the Civil War, is that the fabric that was used for Confederate uniforms at one point was actually just lint and felt that had been mixed with glue and then pressed into sheets. And then they would cut that out and sew it together as clothing and then hand it to somebody. And then the first time it rained, their clothing would dissolve.
And that's how we got the Naked Regiment.
Yeah, that's the 1860s, not the 1960s, but there you go. Right. And
picture a bunch of dudes like charging a hill in a rainstorm and like their clothes are just falling off. Sir, they're taking their clothes off. Sir, their clothes are melting off. Ah! Angry naked men charging us.
Yes. This is gonna, I realize that saying all these things is gonna get us yet again comments that I have to hide on Facebook, and I don't particularly care.
So medium Dan Keath went and got his new glue clothes.
Yeah, exactly.
Got my glue pants.
I don't particularly blame him for deserting. Like, I think maybe the world would have been better off if more people had deserted. I don't know. So after he deserted a second time,
everybody loves a second desert.
Oh, God. Right. Okay, well, I'll edit that out.
No.
No, I won't.
They can't all be hits.
That's true. It's just not my style of comedy, as we know. That doesn't mean that it's invalid. It's just not me. So Vulcans just don't have puns. They probably do. Anyway, after he deserted a second time, he sort of went back to what had been his most successful career before, which was theft, burglary, and other nonviolent property crimes.
There's a lot of upward mobility in that field, you know? Sky's the limit.
He did start way on the bottom.
Yeah.
And all of that sort of got him a lot of unfriendly attention in Tennessee. And so he then moved southeast from where he lived to Rutherford County, North Carolina. And by the 1870s, he was living in Rutherford County and had, along his path to Rutherford County, abandoned 3 wives and 3 sets of children by those wives, all of whom were looking for him, and begun living as a farm laborer out kind of in the middle of the woods in Rutherford County.
Just like Dad.
Just like Dad.
Lots of kids. Working on a farm, keeping your glue pants dry. It's a real legacy.
It is. It's, the family business. So by then, by the 1870s, he had struck on a new way to make money, and it was a scam for selling a fake gold mine.
Okay.
Now, gold mining and the mining of other precious metals, we talked about this in several different episodes, but most recently we talked about this when we talked about the quartz crystal that got mined around Spruce Pine, around the observatories there. That was a huge industry in North and South Carolina in the 18th and 19th centuries. And in fact, I grew up in the mountains of Western North Carolina, poking around the entrance to an abandoned gold mine myself.
Just down the road from where I've lived for a long time is Gold Mine Road.
Yeah.
And that's in the Piedmont. It was statewide.
And if I remember correctly, the Dunhill Hotel is near where there were gold mines in what's now Charlotte, right?
Yeah. Yes. I'm foggy.
We talked to
that.
Spooky CLT about that.
Yes. About the tunnels and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So huge industry, and not just a big industry, but in fact, in 1832 in Rutherford County, North Carolina, a man named Christopher Bechtler minted the first $1 gold coin in the U.S.
That's awesome. I wonder where that is now.
Right? No kidding whatsoever. I would love to know. I managed to read a little about that and saw a photo of it. And so it exists.
It wasn't melted down to fill a cavity years later or anything.
Fingers crossed. No. So according to the legend version of this, Keath ran this scam by taking a large rock and, quote, rubbing it with brass.
Okay.
Using this as a fake gold nugget.
Wow.
I didn't really understand what that meant, what that phrase, rubbing it with brass meant. But my guess is that means he took a rough surfaced rock and rubbed it against brass, or maybe worked some brass into a porous surface.
Let's go all the way back to 5th grade science class, where they bring out the little tray of minerals and the strike plate, and you can test the hardness of the different minerals, right, on the strike plate and see what kind of streak they leave.
Mm-hmm.
I would assume that if one found a soft enough mineral, you could easily mark it up with brass.
Okay.
Or maybe it would need to be harder than the brass. Point is, you could leave a streak, right?
Yeah.
It has been a real long time since I've played with one of those kits. But that's where my head goes when I hear that he rubbed it on it, is that he found something that the hardness didn't line up, and he could, the same way somebody carved Taco Bell into the rock.
There we go. I like this. We're tying to so many different things in this episode. So
people that are listening to us are like, what Taco Bell rock?
You got to go to Facebook and look for the thing about Carriage Rock.
Yeah.
Stagecoach Rock. Sorry.
Stagecoach Rock. That episode hasn't been recorded yet.
Exactly. But however he did this, he then, according to the legend, used that rock to sell his gold mine, quote unquote, to investors, who then, of course, never saw any gold, never got their money back, never found out where this gold mine was, and never saw Keath again.
It's like the guy that was selling Chuck E. Cheese tokens as Bitcoins.
Yes. In this process, Keath became known for always carrying with him his gold rock.
Sure.
Meanwhile, like I said, theoretically, he worked as a laborer, but he was still carrying on his long career of burglary and theft.
That's his bread and butter.
That's foundational. That's just that's right. Making the milk money.
Right.
In January of 1880, however, a girl named Alice Ellis, in some accounts she's 8, in others she's 10, in others she's 12, was found murdered in the woods near Keith's home. She had been bludgeoned, and suspicions quickly fell on Keath and the rock that he carried with him everywhere. Now, keep in mind, this is still the legend version.
Right. Nothing about this guy screams murderer to me yet, especially child murderer, but let's keep it rolling.
Yeah. In some versions of this story, it's told that Keath is clearly innocent. He had never been violent before, just like you said. Like, he's never been violent before. He'd made a lifestyle out of dishonesty, but all the evidence against him in this case was a bloodstained shirt that somebody saw hanging in his yard when they went to ask him questions about the murder. His response was that he had been cleaning game rabbits that day, and he was able to produce rabbit meat and rabbit carcasses. And in one version of this, a kid who lived nearby was able to testify that he had seen Keath on the day of the murder and that Keath was wearing different clothes altogether, so that this bloodstained shirt is meaningless. It's at best circumstantial. In other versions, the accusations against Keath include that he had been seen drunk that day, but that neighbors said he didn't drink. And thus this added detail of him being drunken and violent just doesn't really like fit his profile.
So going back to Home Alone, not that it's, a bastion of reality. One of my points, like rewatching it now, I'm like, why would cat burglars want to commit acts of violence against this child? It goes against everything in their career to do that. Like, they would just simply be like, next.
Yeah,
and move on to the next job. They wouldn't be like, we're going to kill this kid.
Yeah, low-hanging fruit somewhere else. There's an empty house somewhere else in town.
Right. It's just, there's definitely a scale on the criminal scale of what people's motivations are for their actions. And I don't think you necessarily jump directly from minor financial gain to murdering a child.
Yeah. And in other versions of it, his drinking, he did drink, but his drinking caused him to become violent and then black out. And thus he could believably be sort of framed for the murder or suspected of it.
Okay.
In all of these, regardless of that take on how innocent he is or is not, he gets arrested. He goes on trial. He's allowed to choose his own jury. I assume that that's one of the finer points of courtroom protocol from the 19th century that we don't really see today. At the very least, I don't see it on Law and Order. And sat throughout the trial, stolidly refuting his own guilt and claiming calmly that he was innocent throughout. In one version of this story, evidence gets produced that an escaped murderer from a neighboring county had been seen in the area on the day of the killing, and that this was introduced as evidence that somebody else must have done it, but that it's ruled inadmissible in this version of the legend under a ruling that same year in a case called State versus Baxter, in which a court in Cleveland County, neighboring Cleveland County, found that evidence tending to show the guilt of another in the commission of a crime does not disprove the criminality of the charged party, unless the evidence implicating that other shows that his guilt is inconsistent with the guilt of the defendant. In other words, if one of two cats drinks all the milk in the saucer, the fact another cat has milk all over its whiskers does not mean that the first cat didn't drink some milk.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, the notion that a convicted killer had been in the area the same day doesn't prove that Keath didn't kill anyone, so it gets excluded from the trial. I am not a lawyer. I am not a legal expert, and I have no idea if the version in which this gets referenced is in any way a valid application of that precedent. I just find it interesting that that's like so specific. And I looked it up, and that finding exists, and it's about what that says it's about. That said, this story is a real roller coaster, so don't add Big Dan to your Christmas card list just yet.
So he's big now. He's big.
He's big now.
Okay.
After the trial was conducted, the jury found Keath guilty, and the judge sentenced him to die by hanging.
Womp womp.
Keath appealed the ruling, and it went all the way to the state Supreme Court in Raleigh, as did Keath, where the finding was upheld and the sentence was confirmed. And then Keath was returned to Rutherfordton with the date of December 11th, 1880 set for his execution. And that specific date shows up in every version of the story. The sheriff at the time was a man named Noah Walker, and he had Keath moved to Cleveland County's jail in Shelby because he was worried that a mob would show up and try to do the job early, if you will.
Yeah.
At the time, the death penalty was conducted by counties, not by the state. The state, being the authority that conducts executions and keeps records of them, doesn't start until the late 19th, early 20th century. Prior to that point, executions were carried out by the county officials in the place where they had been sentenced. And so it's the sheriff's job to do this.
So that feels very antiquated, but it also makes it very real for the people in the community.
Oh, yeah, I would imagine so. And actually, if you look at the records, many fewer executions, many fewer official executions happened when it was on a very local level.
Oh, I'm sure. It makes it real. It makes it personal.
By many accounts, Walker was really disturbed by this and just wasn't sure what to think. But sort of felt that this was his job. This was literally his job. And so he was going to see it through. In the legend version of it, Walker keeps Keath in a cage in the Cleveland County Jail and has him chained to the bottom of the cage, and then has his coffin constructed and set beside the cage so that Keath has plenty of opportunity to contemplate his fate.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a weird, gruesome little detail. And then Sheriff Walker ordered a scaffolding built and a grave dug next to it, out sort of in a field that was outside of town. And on the appointed day, loaded Keith's coffin into the back of the wagon, sat Keith atop the coffin, a la our favorite shoe shaker from Bath.
Yep.
You're touching so many stories we've talked about. And then took Keith in that wagon out to the field where the hanging was to occur. And even though at the time, state law said that executions were to be private events, in multiple accounts, thousands of people show up to watch. And in one version, there is a picnic air to the event where 7,000 people have followed the wagon on foot.
7,000.
Yeah, 7,000 people follow the wagon out there and set up to watch the execution.
Don't they have like a hoop and stick to go play with, or like any kind of old-timey entertainment besides watching a man die?
You'd think. So Keith is reported when they got there to have inspected his grave, audibly approved of it. Then,
looks good.
Yeah, looks good. Then climbed the scaffolding and said to the crowd and to the sheriff. And here I'm going to give you two versions of what he supposedly said. The first version being, the soul of an innocent man won't ever rest until he can prove himself innocent.
Ooh, ghosty.
Mm-hmm. A man should be hung for what he's done, not what he ain't done.
Mm-hmm.
The second version is that he climbs the scaffolding and says to the assembled and to the sheriff, I never killed nobody. Anybody who says I did is a liar. If you hang me, I'll haunt you all till you're dead and the devil takes you.
Yes, Daniel Keath ghost story.
And then at 1 p.m., he is hanged, he dies immediately, and is immediately buried in the grave that is right next to the scaffolding.
Wow. I thought there was going to be a different twist there. Okay.
In no time at all. In some versions, the same day. In some versions, after a short period of time, a shadow appeared against the south-facing wall of the Rutherford County jailhouse. And the shadow appeared to be of a big man hanging by the neck.
With his fake gold rock in his hands.
So people are understandably upset by the appearance of an inexplicable shadow against the side of the jailhouse wall immediately after Keith has cursed the town.
Mm-hmm.
The sheriff orders the wall whitewashed, and that covers up the shadow, except that it reappears after a few days. And then subsequently orders it whitewashed over and over and over again. And every time it's whitewashed or painted or they cover it up in any way, the shadow sooner or later reappears. Frustrated in one account because his coffee group stops coming by the jailhouse to have coffee with him in the morning because they're freaked out. Sheriff Walker has a climbing vine planted on the side of the building immediately underneath the shadow and trained up over it. And once the vine covers the spot, then the shadow stops appearing. But in that version, someone who claimed to be the great-great-great-great-grandnephew of Sheriff Walker went to the spot where the vine grew on the building as a child in 1954 and peeled the vine away from the building and saw under it the shadow still there.
Love it.
And then in 1960, the jailhouse was torn down. According to the legend, every business that has been built in that space since then has failed spectacularly. And the belief is that Big Dan cursed the land where he was held a prisoner and nothing can succeed there.
Or he's just like pilfering out of the register of every business that opens there. He is a thief.
Maybe there's just a lot of embezzling happening.
Yeah.
I said after I read this, okay, there are a lot of fantastical details here. What about the actual history? It turns out there is a ton of history to back this story up and to correct certain parts of it. So first I went to my usual first source, the U.S. Census records for the 19th century. And there I found absolutely nothing. No Daniel Keath born in Kentucky at the right time. No Daniel Keath dying in North Carolina at the right time. Nothing. So then I thought, well, okay, I'll check Confederate Army records, which are notoriously spotty.
Right.
like we talked about, the Confederate Army was in many ways a ragtag assemblage. They did not do a great job of keeping records in the first place. A lot of their records were destroyed. A lot of their records have been lost over time, despite a really concerted effort by the United States government to find and preserve those records.
Mm-hmm. We've used some of the U.S. federal records from the Civil War in other episodes to find people.
Absolutely. The National Archives has everything that they've been able to get their hands on. But the bottom line is you can't archive what nobody much bothered to write down,
Right.
So it turned up 0 in the National Archives. Then I went to the Tennessee website where you can search for Confederate records, and it turns out that website's busted. Then, literally all the links to that part of the website are broken. Nice. So, okay. Then I searched historical newspapers for any mention of Keath's gold mine scam, the murder, Keath's trials and execution, anything. Found nothing.
Oh.
But then I searched for court records in North Carolina, and I found exactly one thing. I found an image of the handwritten file folder tab for the case of a Daniel Keath, spelled Keath, before the North Carolina Supreme Court in 1880.
There you go. We're in business.
Yeah, it's not a copy of the court proceedings. It's just the fact that the file folder exists.
Yeah.
But that told me his name was spelled differently from the way and I assume everybody else who's listening to this, thought it would be spelled Keith. And in fact, in every version of the legend that I can find online or in that book, it is spelled Keith. But that's
Good
not the name.
Catch.
Thank you very much. So I went back through all of my research with this variant spelling. And there he is.
Yes. Success.
He turns up in the 1880 census, listed as a prisoner in the Cleveland County Jail, having been born in Kentucky in 1848.
There's our guy.
There were a bunch of other people with the same spelling, Daniel Keath, a couple of good candidates out of them who show up in earlier census records, a couple of them who show up having been born in Rutherford County, Tennessee in 1848, things like that. Weird little coincidences, things like that. But most of them seem not to be this guy. So as far as I can tell, the first time I know it's him, it's the 1880 census, and he's listed as a prisoner in the Cleveland County Jail, which lines up with the legend because he'd been moved to Cleveland County to keep him from being hanged early by a mob. It also kind of lines up with the idea of him having been a drifter for most of his life and probably even living under various pseudonyms for most of his life.
Sure. How many wives did he leave?
Yeah, 3 wives that we know of.
Yeah, he wasn't using the same name.
Yeah, but there he is in the 1880 census. So just like the legend, and listed as having been born in Kentucky, just like the legend. With the correct spelling of his name and some additional details, I was able to find his case covered in newspapers at the time, as far afield as Chicago.
Oh, my.
I found articles from the Chicago Daily Tribune, the modern-day Chicago Tribune, and the Washington Post, and closer to home, the Wilmington Star.
Wow.
All of these accounts differ on the dates of specific parts of the story and on what Keath said at his hanging, but they all agree that he absolutely did commit that murder.
See, I don't know that he did.
The version as reported at that time is this. In January of 1880, Keath showed up at the home of a neighbor and told that neighbor that he, Keath, had encountered a violent criminal who had escaped from a neighboring county and that the escapee had attacked him in the woods. Keath said he fought the man off and got away, but that he wanted this neighbor to go with him into the woods to find the fugitives so that they could split the reward money that was being offered for his capture. The neighbor agreed to go, but in all these accounts, quote, soon began to suspect Keath of lying.
Yeah, that's a weird one. This took a turn.
And turned back home, leaving Keath to go search by himself.
Sure.
Keath then assembles a posse of other people to go into the woods with him, using the same story. Once the search party enters the woods, Keath found, quote unquote, the body of Alice Ellis, age 13, called the rest of the party over and said, oh, the guy who attacked me must have attacked her also.
So that's where that came from. So it's not like that other thing where there actually was somebody spotted by third parties. It was a story that he concocted. So it's very different than the story I was talking about.
Very different. Yes. Very different from the way that Folklore presents this.
Yeah.
The search party immediately became suspicious because they said Keath basically went straight to her body in the woods and then yelled, hey, everybody, I found someone.
Yeah, that's not how these things work.
Yeah. When they got suspicious, they started questioning him, and his story immediately started to unravel. So they grab him, they take him to the sheriff, they hand him over, and he is arrested on the spot for Alice Ellis's murder. Alice Ellis was, in fact, the daughter of the neighbor whom Keath first got to go into the woods with him.
Oh, Daniel Keath, you are a word I can't say.
Yeah.
On this show.
The trial occurred more or less as described in the legend, except that Keath appears to have just sat passively throughout, showing no emotion, no remorse, not really speaking, not really doing anything. And after his appeal to the state Supreme Court failed, he asked the jailer, according to news stories at the time, to place his coffin by the cage where he was being kept, and began, in at least one account, writing out a lengthy confession of all of his crimes, including the murder.
Wow.
In the Chicago Tribune version, when he gets to the execution, he does give a speech before his hanging, but in it he says, "I thank God that I am willing to give my life for that I took. I never took that of any other person."
Interesting. So, a lot to unpack here. I do wonder, so he was financially motivated in his crimes up until this point, right? I wonder what happened.
According to the news accounts at the time, and according to some of the official listings, he also assaulted her.
Okay, so Daniel Keath got the benefit of the doubt at first, and now I'm pro mob at this point.
A particularly gruesome detail of his execution is that when they placed the noose around his neck, his last words were, "It's cold, ain't it?" And then they dropped him.
Yeah, he's no Lavinia Fisher. He's no wordsmith.
Yeah. According to some newspapers, he was sentenced to hang on the 11th, according to others on the 24th of December, 1880. But they all agree that he was hanged on the 17th of December. And I suspect that's because they needed a couple of warm days in order to dig a grave.
All right. Well, this has been a journey of twists and turns, as you described that it would be. Wow. The fact that there were witnesses testifying against him and his behavior changes everything.
Yeah. And although I turned up 0 in death records and executions are conducted by counties, I was able to find on the NC Gen Web project page, which is sort of a sub project of what's called US Gen Web, which is a genealogy project. They had a listing of all the executions performed by Rutherford County in Rutherford County in the 19th century. There were only 3. And right there, December 17th, 1880, is Daniel Keath, whose profession is listed as stock swindler. So I thought at the time, maybe stock swindler meant something else. I thought, well, what if that meant he was like cattle rustling?
Sure.
I looked it up. No, stock swindler was a very well-known term for people who sold people fake stock. He was selling people shares in his fake gold mine, and that was his primary income.
We know somebody like that.
Don't we? Yeah.
Running a certain crowd-funded investment thing. That's funny.
Yeah.
Tale as old as time. I don't like the way this went. I gotta be honest with you. I was like, yeah, rubbing gold nuggets together. Ha ha. This is like taking a turn, and I was like, well, now I'm sad.
Yeah. So Daniel Keath was real. The story of the murder and the trial and the hanging and everything is all real. What I think is not real is that he was innocent. And I think it is not real that he cursed the town as his final act. That said, what the news reports from the time say his last words were vary between not mentioning it to what I read, which is sort of middle of the road, to a lengthy diatribe against the evils of alcohol, which seems to me to have been an editor somewhere having decided that they were going to put words in his mouth, because this was also the beginning of the temperance movement.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure we can trust what the reported last words were. Frankly, I'm not sure that we can trust the reporting about any of it, because at the time, journalism was unreliable sometimes, as we talked about in the Chimney Rock episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know, man. If he did it, then I'm pro mob. If he didn't do it, then obviously a mistake was made. But if there's accounts of there being people at trial that were willing to give the amount of detail, I don't know, man. It started so fun.
So, as for the shadow on the wall of the jailhouse, I have no idea if that's real, except to say that many sources of this story agree that the place was dismal and was widely avoided after this, and that the jailhouse did bear this shadow, and that it wasn't attributed to anything else that could be casting a shadow against the side of the wall, and that it all looked to them like Daniel Keath. And so I love that part of the story because it's creepy and weird. And so I say, keep it in. I have no idea. Evil people can curse places too, you know?
Right.
These days, the location of the original Rutherford County Jail, which is the corner of North Carolina 108 and US 221 in Rutherfordton, is a little retail area. Like there's a Domino's and there's a CVS, that kind of thing. And I don't know if any of them have spectacularly gone out of business.
I'm just picturing a strip mall with like the one spot that's always vacant.
Yeah, exactly. Like I kind of wonder, like, are they all in operation still? I don't know.
Right.
But I would be interested to see if in the right light anybody sees any shadows cast against the sides of those buildings. In the meantime, I think this is a fascinating example of folklore and the way that folklore takes a story and sort of processes it into something to sort of retain what it wants to retain and cut out the parts that it doesn't want to remember. Because the story has turned into, this was an innocent person who was done in because of other crimes that he committed, to the point that there's like songs that have been written about Daniel Keath.
Huh.
A lot of this has been inscribed as a story of, well, he did really bad things, but he didn't do this bad thing. And so he wants revenge. And I think that tells us a lot about the cultural values that somebody is trying to preserve at various points in the story. The idea that people who did something wrong should be held accountable for what they did. You shouldn't make stuff up to go after someone, things like that. Stuff that I don't have any objection to, but I think that this kind of like the story of the peddler in the Happy Dog story, Ghost Town of Goshen Hill. I feel like that's a way for folklore to like take something good, like be nice to strangers, don't automatically assume the worst of them, don't jump to conclusions. That stuff gets encoded in a story and gets like worked into the fabric of something that's based on fact so that those values can be transmitted as part of a narrative.
Well, it's certainly a good one. This might be one of the darker ones we've ever done.
It is. I'm not really sure how to edit it or when to release it because
just put a warning on the front.
Yeah, it feels really grim.
Yeah, I would say just put a warning on the front and just say we're going to talk about some things. This winds up going true crime in a way that might be upsetting for some people to hear.
It's a weird one.
Yeah. No, that was a good one. Thank you for the research. Good catch on the name.
No, thank you. Reading through it, I kept being like, this is not somebody who would murder people. This is somebody who would rob people. But then finding out that there are extenuating circumstances around this crime, it's like, oh, that's what happened.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening to another Arcane Carolinas. We'll be back with more squatching around.
I also think it was a great opportunity to talk a little about how we do our research. So
totally. That's great. All right.
Thanks for listening. Michael here again after that roller coaster. Thanks for listening. Like I said at the start, I want to expand a little on a topic that Charlie and I touch on at the very end. That idea we discussed that folklore is a way to process real history. Pretty much any formal definition of folklore includes that it's a way for people to preserve and pass down ideas and values they consider important to their own culture and identity. We've talked on the show before about the importance of drawing a distinction between stories meant to entertain and stories presented as history. And that difference is pretty important in the case of the legend of Daniel Keath, Gold Swindler, star of bluegrass songs and fun, spooky ghost stories, versus the historical record of Daniel Keath with an A, horrifyingly cold-blooded murderer. Folklore is sometimes a way we make horrifying true events more palatable, and in the process, the real history gets painted over. I don't point that out to say folklore is bad, though, or that it's a way of hiding from history. Quite the contrary. I mean that this turned out to be a great opportunity to remember that there's almost always more to the story. Nearly every time Charlie and I encounter some tantalizing tale, we find that the story itself is interesting, and the real history behind it is also worth learning about and learning from. I think it's great to spend some time asking why the folkloric version of this history is different from the facts as they appear to be from this far away in time and in culture and day-to-day life. I suspect the answer to that question, the cultural values being preserved and passed down, varies from one generation to the next or from one person to the next. I think for some people it's a way to turn the story around so that a man is the victim rather than a woman, because our society has always tried to avoid talking about the ways women are marginalized and victimized. I think for some people it's a way to talk about their sense that the mechanisms of justice can seem arbitrary and remote, even when they're the same sheriff people stop in to have coffee with in the morning. And I think for some people it's a way to preserve something Charlie brought up, which is that the consequences of a crime are both immediate and local and ripple down through a community for generations, even for the people who are charged with enforcing the law. That thing Charlie said about how the crime and the court and the sheriff are all local and real rather than distant and abstract. I don't think asking those questions is overanalyzing folklore either. Folklore exists to communicate ideas. I think by asking what those ideas are and whose they are and why they want to pass them on is a way of respecting them and their role. Stories like this are the shadows on the wall of culture, and they're the climbing vine planted to hide it from view. And like that great-great-great-great-grandnephew of Sheriff Walker, I think we honor history when we peel back the vine and find the shadow underneath. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now, and I will finally let the episode end. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards. Okay, I am now recording to this computer. Feel free to bring us in. Unless you want me to.
So we've already been talking it's 40 minutes after we were going to start. So it feels a little disingenuous. But we'll do it.